Welcome to Tenacity with Sonia C, the podcast where entrepreneurs, founders, and ambitious professionals come to learn from those who have walked the path, navigating challenges and achieving success. Whether it's thriving in business, pivoting, scaling for growth, fundraising, or finding work-life balance, dealing with loneliness, adversity, or overcoming personal struggles. Our guests share the insights and strategies that have empowered them to level up. I'm your host, Sonia, and let's get started. My guest today is David Snider. David is the former COO and CFO of Compass, where he scaled the company from pre-launch to $350 million in revenue and raised $300 million, ultimately valuing the company at $1.8 billion. Now, as the founder and CEO of Harness, David is transforming how individuals and businesses connect with top-tier tax and financial professionals, and he's raised $36 million from investors. In this episode, we'll dive into David's journey, his insights on scaling companies to billion-dollar valuations. Hi, David. Welcome to the show. How are you today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you and get into this conversation. So let's talk about your experience in building Compass. When you joined Compass, it was a pre-launch. What were the key strategies and decisions that helped you scale the company from 0 to 350 million in revenue? Because that's a lot.
Yeah, I think the first one was recognizing when you had something that was working versus not. So when I joined the business, we were very focused on disrupting the role of the traditional real estate agent. I think for those that live in certainly New York City, maybe lots of other places, the process feels expensive, feels broken. So we sort of took a very consumer-oriented lens to things, and it was a compelling story. I was able to raise 25 million of capital around that idea, but sort of inside the tent, we recognized that there were a lot of challenges to scaling the initial model that we had.
Mm.
But we sort of had this insight that, gosh, maybe the real estate agent's actually very hardworking, and it's the brokerage in this equation that's taking a third of the economics, really not delivering more than a antiquated brand to help the agent create and deliver better results for their clients and their business. And so we, decided, hey, like, what if we really focus on, turning the phone in the agent's pocket into a powering force and create this entire tech platform, not just to power new agents, but ones that really were running serious businesses and had the desire to invest and to grow quickly. And so once we realized that was the case, we had raised enough capital that we had the room to transition, had to make some changes in the composition of the team, but were able, during the next, 4+ years that I was there building, and, the 5, 6+ since then, to continue sort of along that thread, and now to be the largest platform for real estate advisors in the US.
Real estate in general is such a traditional industry. There hasn't been a lot of disruption to it. So what was it like for you guys as a company when you launched this product and you're disrupting an industry? Like, did people love it or did they hate it?
Well, uh, it's not great to start out with a lot of fanfare and advertise that you believe the industry pricing is too expensive and you're going to cut prices. So, did not have a lot of friends, out of the gate. And then when we actually pivoted away from that sort of discount as part of the core offering, we then had the double challenge of like convincing those, meaning the agents we wanted to recruit, but that no longer was a part of the value proposition, and a lot of industry people that, were not necessarily rooting for our success. I think ultimately you have to demonstrate a lot of value to the people that are early adopters. I think the very early agents, many of which were still there at Compass, were excited to be at the vanguard of where they felt like their profession their industry could be. And so you win those folks over. And if they come over and are then talking to friends and saying, it really is much better than, what we experienced together at, Douglas Elliman or at Corcoran or somewhere else, then you can build on that pretty quickly. But you definitely are going to start with this cohort of people in legacy feeling industries that want to be innovative. And then you can slowly over time get enough momentum and share to win over the holdouts or the risk averse.
Yeah, yeah. As a CFO, you raised 300 million for Compass. What were the most critical elements in securing investments from major players like Fidelity and Wellington Management, and how that did that shape the company's trajectory?
Yeah, so it was definitely, even though we were New York based and tackling a traditional industry, a hyper growth approach that required a lot of venture capital. And so it was almost like clockwork in terms of every year going out to raise, in our case, bigger and bigger rounds just to sustain compounding growth on some really big numbers. I think that I'll start with the challenge and then I'll go into kind of what worked, I guess, on it. Back in 2013, 14, 15, 16, the idea of venture investment in tech-enabled services was still pretty nascent. I mean, you didn't have a lot of examples of people not just building software, but actually building software, but running the company in the same model as the traditional incumbent players. And so I think rightly, a lot of investors said, well, aren't you just a brokerage? Why should you have not why should you exist, but how do we think about the valuation that you're aspiring to, et cetera? That's part of that. And I think it sort of requires or saying, hey, listen, valuation is just a expectation of future cash flows and a belief in sort of how long it's going to take you to get there and how quickly you're going to grow to do so. And so it's really around building a model that people felt like was evident in the data. I think New York was our first market. In many ways, it's one that has a deeper profit pool, but it helped to tell a story that what worked over a number of years in one market could work in a lot of other places. I mean, that I think is what businesses like Uber that were in their sort of valuation peaks when we were doing this really had done a great job of doing, which was, hey, there's a traditional, very human, very capital intensive industry with a different approach. There's a really big, really valuable business to be built around that. And so I think that was put, you sort of had to hang your hat on. And the fact that this was a, depending on how you sliced it, 60 billion, 70 billion, $80 billion, US residential commission market, very fragmented, very little competitive barriers or moats that the larger players in the space had built that I think helped get, not all, I had a lot of conversations for every dollar of capital raised, but many, marquee investors to feel like this was a space that ought to be innovated in. And this felt like a team and an approach that was getting really good traction and tackling it.
Okay. So after experiencing costly tax advice, you founded Harness to help others avoid similar pitfalls. How did you validate the idea for Harness, and what was the first step you took to bring it to life?
Sure. Well, maybe just to give that intro a little bit of flavor for the audience. When I was first taking on this role of leading finance and operations at Compass, there was a question about how to structure the equity program. And I, at the time, was in my second year of business school and asked two Harvard professors who are entrepreneurial finance gurus, hey, should we do this, thing that some people have talked about? And the answer was, oh no, you definitely don't want to do that, et cetera. And it may have philosophically been good advice, but at this moment in time, especially after a big tax law change that had gone into effect um, in the years kind of post Great Recession, it ended up being a call that was a seven-figure mistake for me and some others out there. And so I think it triggered the thought that, gosh, when I looked around, there had been all this amazing innovation at the entry points of consumer fintech, neobanks and robo-advisors and insurtechs. But for individuals that had a complexity level that exceeded what these great new DIY solutions could offer, there really hadn't been a ton of investment or innovation. And so that was sort of one kernel. The other one was Compass, at least for me, had sort of shown in spaces where people still really care about getting advice from a trusted advisor. Um, those professions, those advisors are not going away, but they had not been the most in favor for venture-backed businesses to sort of invest in and try to improve what that experience could look like. And so this idea of how do you build technology that can uplift the way that consumers are interacting with, their advisors. And I think, I sort of detailed that one painful experience on sort of the strategy side. But when I thought about the interactions that I'd had with, my tax advisor, very bright, very well-meaning, it felt like going back in time, every year in terms of where you're uploading documents and what information they knew about you, and
Mm.
not a lot of confidence that, every piece of what should be in there was in there. And so, it's those kernels where you're like, hey, this feels like a big market. There's some macro trends that feel like more people that are generating wealth and complexity want a different type of experience than what was being delivered 30 years ago. And that felt like an opportunity worth pursuing.
And fintech has done so well in the tech space. So I keep seeing more and more fintechs coming up, and I think there's just a need for these types of applications out there.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's a space where both in the segments with massive players like banking, there's
Hmm.
been unbelievable disruption in some cases because the profit margins are big. Therefore, you can eat away at that with new models. In some cases, because there's so much infrastructure that consumers don't actually care about or want, that you
Mm.
can eat about it. And then I think on the other end of the spectrum, where we focused, most of the best advice for individuals who have less than $25 million, which is virtually all of us,
Mm.
is being done by advisors that are working relatively independently, whether they're associated with a brand or not.
Yeah.
And acknowledging that fact and creating technology that help them connect with the right clients, serve those clients more effectively is both a huge market opportunity, but it's also more importantly, just a huge value creation opportunity. I mean, getting stuff right, especially early on in the money-making cycle for individuals, our clients, et cetera, just
Mm.
compounds over time. And so excited every day about, what if we continue to get this right, we can do in terms of helping people get to better financial outcomes for themselves and their families.
Love it. So you raised 36 million for Harness from prominent investors. What advice do you have for founders trying to attract high profile investors? And how do you approach building those relationships?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm very fortunate that I've now been doing it for a long time. So I think I take for granted sometimes that access to people who are even there to make a decision. So I've been told no vastly more times than yes. So there's sort of two pieces. There's advice to get yourself in a conversation to get this stuff to happen. And there's how do you convince those people, even if they conceptually like you. I don't mean to suggest everyone I know in the venture world likes me. How to get that done. So I think on the first piece, there are so many people out there that have the aspiration to start and build a business that investors have to look for reasons to say no and or reasons that are kernels of validation to say yes. And so, sure, if you happen to have gone to a handful of marquee universities in a CS program, like that's great, and it's a head start. That's not the case for the vast majority of folks. I think ultimately figuring out how to network your way over time. Like I just finished a really interesting book called The Great CEO Within by Matt Moriarty. And he talks about the value of actually having 3 to 4 people all paying one investor, encouraging them to take a meeting with you. And so you're like, well, that's great if I know 3 or 4 people that all know one investor. But I think that approach of how do you really triangulate how do you, show up at some of the events where you might meet a junior person at a firm, which you'd say, well, gosh, that's not the decision maker, but you sort of use
Mm,
that networking to get to others over time, et cetera. You want to build some familiarity where that's possible just to, get a foot in the door. Um, I think the broader piece is just understanding that you've got to be fairly pithy. And I'm terrible at this in some respects of the current business, which has a lot of complexity. We're B2B, we're B2C, a lot of things going on. But um, especially if investors are not ones that have backed you before or know a tremendous amount about the certain problem you're solving for, it's got to click and resonate pretty quickly. And so I think being able to articulate both the why this business should exist, why now, and why you or that initial team
mm,
needs to come through pretty quickly. And a framing of the problem in a way that someone sees, hey, this can be a really big business. Interestingly, like despite it being a miserable time to raise capital at most stages, I would say that from the conversations I've had with early stage investors, like the valuations of seed stage companies still tend to be pretty robust, which is a great thing if you're going out and doing those raises, but it also means the hurdle is higher that if you're raising a $10 million valuation round early in the life cycle of the company, or even 15 plus, the investor has to believe that there's a high probability of not just 10, but probably, a 20x
mm.
growth, return, et cetera, from there. And so again, you don't have to actually be tackling all of this. The more focused you are in many cases, the better. But you know, paint the story of why there's a really big addressable market, even if you're, as you should, focusing on the pain point of maybe a small subsegment of that bigger opportunity.
And if you happen to get lucky enough to raise, and what can entrepreneurs or founders expect from the investors that that invest in their businesses?
I think there's a wide range, and there's sort of a two by two that when investors, I mean, when founders are talking about different investors, I sort of say, and there are lots of ways to cut this, but for me, that two by two is how much time is an investor going to consume of yours, after they write the check, and how much value they going to create.
Mm,
It's amazing to find some that are really judicious with the time that they consume and add a ton of value. It's totally okay if they consume a lot of time, add a lot of value. It's okay if they don't take a lot of time and don't add a lot of value in many cases. But the one, quadrant you try to avoid are those that consume a ton of time and don't, add a lot of value. And so it ranges wildly. I mean, I think typically, um, even if it's not demanded, it's great hygiene to get into a motion of having a regular cadence of board meetings, information dissemination. I mean, what good investors should be doing is not telling you exactly how to run the business, but helping to understand what are you trying to achieve?
mm,
What do you think the milestones are to getting there? And then helping to evaluate, are you on track across each element of the business that they likely have seen a lot of times that through pattern recognition, they can say, hey, if your goal is to build this whole new offering for this new segment and you've got two engineers, well, that may be challenging. What's depending on how they frame it, strategy for expanding R&D and being able to have the capabilities that you want?
yeah.
Or, you know, if the goal is to, reach X number of consumers and getting those active users before we ever charge for them, what are the marketing efforts that are going to get us there, et cetera? And so I think that can be really helpful. And then hopefully through introductions and other stuff, actually meaningfully benefit business development, sales, hiring, you name it.
Got it. So you scaled Compass to 1.8 billion. What were the biggest operational challenges during this rapid growth phase, and how did you overcome them?
Uh,
I'm sure
there
there
are a
was.
lot. I'm not sure. I think the key is overcoming those that are truly blockers to getting to the next stage, and being okay with not everything working perfectly all at once, especially as is often the case when you're managing, far more people or teams than any best practice management book would tell you is ideal. Um, in the role that I had, I was a very young executive. I'd worked for 4 years before business school, jumped into this seat. I was an army of one out of the gate as head of finance and operations, and then, quickly became the company's first C-level executive outside of the founders. And what I had to do, and I think what enabled me to be successful enough to keep the trains on the track and not have the huge growth derail the business, was to figure out, hey, what are the functions that we have to bring in great people to lead?
Mm-hmm.
What are the types of skills that someone who is great in that function ought to bring? And then figuring out how to evaluate strong candidates to actually fill out the team. And so I think what really was key was, in fairly fast succession, being able to hire a great head of facilities because we were opening, 40 offices in 2 years, to bring in someone who would run people and culture in a really big, highly functioning organization to mitigate the number of errors that we were going to make in, rapid team expansion, management, et cetera, to, um, find a really strong general counsel, communications leader, et cetera. I think that was what I was able to bring that enabled the business that was growing very quickly to be able to continue, and to work through some of those challenges over time.
Okay. And from your experience at Compass and Harness, what are the top three lessons every entrepreneur should learn when it comes to scaling their business?
Well, I'm certainly still learning them. So I think rarely do you find an entrepreneur, even those that I'm spending time with, that have been way more successful in repeats, that have all the answers. I think the first is, perfect process will not get you perfect outcomes. So I think what's really important is to balance, yes, like you want to be very thoughtful in your hiring process, your interview loops, like being better at that will generate better results, but you can also be perfect at your organizational design and the processes for goal setting and team management and still not succeed as a business.
Mm,
So I think understanding that there is a very messy, in the vast majority of cases, kind of product market fit journey that is related to, but not the same thing
mm,
as building great processes that ultimately are required to help you scale, when you find that, and or just to run a business that people want to be part of for the
okay.
long term. Um, there are lots of businesses actually that are financially successful that never get the process or the things right, but still just have stumbled on a product that has such resonance in the market, at least at a point in time, that it succeeds in spite of itself in many respects. So I would say number one. I think, um, despite that, and again, this is one where it's like easier to give the advice than to always live it. Um, Businesses, especially fast growing businesses in the tech ecosystem, there's some that are hardware based, or others, the outcomes are driven by people.
Mm,
I think understanding for your organization, how you can make everyone feel connected and create better results, and hopefully have some degree of loyalty and contribution beyond what they absolutely have to do not to get fired. But there also be certain areas of the business and certain people that will just create differential value, and being able to hopefully identify them, to be close to them, that they feel like there's a responsiveness between leadership, CEO, what they're doing, and feel connected to positive outcomes is really important. And then the third is, I think, just the importance of storytelling. I mean, I remember when I was still in business school, there was a founder that I met at a conference. So I went to go see in his office about potentially working for him. And he was like, "Hey, David, I know you've got this great background, but at the end of the day, building successful businesses, software businesses, venture-backed businesses, you're either a builder or you're a seller. And like, you don't want to code, so you're not a builder. you're a seller. And granted, he was trying to convince me to take this like enterprise sales role at his company, which I think I probably would have been terrible at. But I do think he was right. I just didn't understand what he was saying, nor was it probably what he meant, which is that to be successful, you have to be good at sales in the sense of communicating a narrative that people want to be bought into. And I think at Compass, I was an effective salesperson with investors, incredibly telling a story of why this people intensive brokerage business could actually, be disrupted, and a multi-billion dollar business, which Compass is today, could be built. And then being able to sell seasoned, executives, operators, et cetera, that it was worth investing a chapter of their career in helping to build this business. I think now as the CEO founder, it's that stuff plus talking to, clients and BD partners and other things, and also convincing them of the same thing. So I think over investing in the crispness of your story, how it can resonate, hook, get different people excited that are required for your success
Mm.
is very, very important. And often, I think, either not understood early on or just not invested, myself included, as much as we ought to for the value that storytelling can create.
Mm. I agree with you, and it's you see this happen over and over and over again in most startups. So I'm glad you've made those points, and hopefully our listeners will learn from that. So I just wanted to go into like navigating transitions a little bit. How did your role as COO and CFO at Compass prepare you for the leadership journey at Harness? And what skills did you have to learn to refine for this new venture?
So I think I was fortunate in the role that I had at Compass to see and be part of all of the key strategic decisions. I think that many people that are either repeat founders or fortunate like I was to be, they are very close to the establishment of the company and sort of treated as almost like a founder. You sort of run away. Either you run and say, okay, we did something, like let's do exactly the same thing, and forget to learn from some of the stuff that, didn't work, but, was part of a narrative. Or gosh, like I'm going to run away from all the things that were, unpleasant, et cetera. And I think being an operator in that environment tried to do a balance of those things, but there were some pieces that I think, I ran too far away from, and other things, you don't change, et cetera, in doing it. I think, there's an inherent stress in being at a fast growing company with trying to anticipate and understand what a founder CEO wants to do in how he or she is driving the business. That if you're trying to manage a big organization nimbly, creates a ton of stress day to day. And what I think I probably intuitively knew implicitly, but maybe not explicitly, is you make that transition, you're a founder CEO, you get to make all the decisions, but the stress of that is just as high. It's just different. You bear the responsibility for all the people who have put capital to work behind your idea. I would argue, more importantly, people that have devoted a chapter of their career to working with you in support of that mission, et cetera. And so, anything I think in this ecosystem is, whether you're an operator, whether you're a founder, um, way more stressful than most, not all, corporate jobs. But that, I think, is also what makes it exciting. I mean, I'm a tennis player, not a great one, but I love watching the US Open. And there's a sign in Arthur Ashe Stadium that you'll see watching the television coverage on the ramps of players coming in, that says pressure is a privilege. And I think that is kind of like, if I had to pick a tag phrase for the venture ecosystem, that definitely is part of it. That I think for those that are fortunate to be able to raise capital, to recruit people that are likely, working for less than what they could in some other places. It's super exciting. You have the opportunity to build something that's never existed before, but the pressure is real in doing that in a lot of different dimensions. And um, some people love it, some people tolerate it as part of the equation. I think some people think that they will like it and find that that is not necessarily an attribute that they want as part of their lives for a very long period of time.
I think a number of that is also a lot of people who regret getting into it at all, and they wanted to get out because it's not all it seems to be. Everyone, especially for technology, for some odd reason, when I talk to other industries, they're always very straightforward about it. But tech, it's always like everyone thinks it's so cool, and everyone wants to get into it, and then when they do, it's like, wait a minute, this is not what I was sold. What do you
Yeah.
mean I have to like be poor for the first 10 years before this thing can even take off? And sometimes, people think they have great ideas, but they can't execute,
Mhm.
right? There's having an idea and being able to process it and think you can build it, but then there's the building, and then there's the marketing, and then there's the sales. And sometimes entrepreneurs are not CFOs or good salespeople or good marketing people, so they don't plan all of that ahead of time, and that's why sometimes we see a lot of failures too in tech.
There are definitely a lot of failures. There are a lot of things that I think have to line up to be successful, and a lot of things that can take well-intentioned, in many cases, like great ideas, and not let them get to the finish line of what people intend.
So before we wrap up, I just have one more question for you. With the success of Harness, has sorry, with the success Harness has had so far, what's next for the platform, and how do you plan to continue innovating in the financial advisory space?
So we started the business as a traditional marketplace to help next generation builders, business owners, equity holders, et cetera, navigate financial complexity by creating a platform people could figure out what services were going to be most valuable to them, who the best providers were, and then creating some enablement around them. What we found along that journey was that tax tended to be the service that people needed first, in many cases needed most, but it was also one where it was incredibly difficult to find
Mm,
great advisors. And if you did find a great advisor, that you would have a positive experience based on software and process and everything else. And so we've spent the last couple of years building what we believe is, the best tax experience for someone who's outgrown the DIY solutions and wants, the right type of advice for the complexity that they have. I think there is a immensely long roadmap that sits, on paper and in my head around how the data that goes into the tax process can be leveraged to create far more insightful decision making planning for the clients that we serve. And so we're still, even though we're a number of years into this journey, I think in the very early innings of how much value we can continue to unlock both for the advisor client collaboration experience, but also just from the insight that people can have and the better decisions they can make by having the right advisors and advisory platform behind them.
love it. Well, David, thank you so much for joining me today. I appreciate you sharing your personal journey with both of these companies and giving us advice on how to overcome some of the challenges that we are going to come up against as founders and entrepreneurs. I appreciate your time.
Thank you for the great questions. My pleasure.
Hey, that was good. How do you
Excellent.
feel about that? Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, again, you asked good questions. Hopefully, my answers were an appropriate length
Yeah.
for you relative to
Good. Perfect.
expectations. But no, thought that was great and hopefully relevant for the audience based on, the other conversations I've heard you host.
Yeah. I mean, I'm in tech, so I started this with the purpose of doing just tech,
Mhm.
but I've had people reach out, so I'm like, there's other things that even people in tech can learn from. So, but I'm always trying to like have more tech companies come on and teach, walk us through some of the things that they've been on. So I was excited when your team reached out to me. I'm like, yes, another tech company.
Good, good. Well, yeah, we didn't, dive into all the tax planning for tech people, et cetera, but I like just being part of the conversation and I
Yeah.
can pique people's interest if it's relevant.
Well, I mean, just knowing that there's an application out there like yours that helps them with that process, I think is already super helpful and
Yeah,
already gets their wheels turning in the sense of if I'm going to go down this path, there's an avenue that I can go to and get what I need. So, yeah, we didn't get into all the details of it, but I try to keep it more on the
I
high
like
level.
that better. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, well, so I will let you know when it's going to go live. We're going to do all the editing. It'll probably be around November
Okay.
because October's Breast Cancer Awareness Month. So I'm going to do like a whole series for that. So it'll probably be around November.
Yep.
And then once it goes live, I'll send an email with all the links to everything. We'll spend first we launch the audio episode on the podcast, and then we'll do social media, LinkedIn, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube. So there'll be lots of stuff going on throughout that
Is
week or those 2 weeks, and you guys can reshare and reuse everything.
perfect. Yeah. We're predominantly LinkedIn and Twitter of those platforms. So that's great. We'll
Perfect.
plug right in.
All right. Awesome. Well, thank you, David. I appreciate your time.
My pleasure. Great to meet you.
You too. Bye bye.
Thanks.
I want to thank David for joining me today. I hope you gained valuable insights into scaling a business, raising capital, and overcoming some of the challenges of entrepreneurship. And that's a wrap. To our listeners, thank you for joining me on this journey of learning, growth, and inspiration. Don't forget to subscribe to this podcast on your favorite platform and connect with our community on social media. I'd love to hear your feedback, so leave a review and let me know what topics you'd want to explore in future episodes. Remember, the future belongs to those who embrace challenges, adapt with tenacity, and keep pushing forward. Keep growing, keep pivoting, and most importantly, stay tenacious in your pursuits. Thank you for tuning in, and I look forward to bringing you more insightful conversations in our upcoming episodes. This is Sonia signing off, but as always, keep chasing your dreams with tenacity.